In this video, we're going to take our post-processing skills a little bit further with a technique that I call pre-masking. Now, pre-masking is where we edit a raw file in order to give us a good luminosity mask. And I'm going to show you how to do that when we open up our exposures in Photoshop. So right now I have the two exposures that you'll find in your download. I have the darker exposure here, which exposes well for the sky, and also a brighter exposure that we're going to use as the base exposure. Now, before we do anything, I just want to bring the highlight slider down a little bit so that we bring back some of this sky here. It's not really overexposed, but I just want some more details in the brightest part of the sky. The next thing I want to do is probably change the color because I think it's a little bit too warm. So I'm going to bring the temperature slider down with both layers selected, just so we reduce some of that warmth. I think that looks okay. And then I'm going to, with the darker exposure selected, bring up vibrance a tiny bit. And that's to increase the vibrance of the clouds and maybe bring in a little bit more tint, just so we've got a tiny bit more pink in those clouds. I think that's a bit too much. Let's stop at, let's say, 29. Now with both of these layers selected, I'm going to go to lens corrections and I'm just going to use remove chromatic aberration. And the reason why I'm doing that is because if we choose enable profile corrections here, you'll see the image changes. And some of this corner is cut off, but I actually want the details in this corner to be more visible. So I'm going to undo that. And it's fine to do that in this image because even if we do have barrel distortion, the scene's a little bit odd anyway. It's not like we have straight lines or buildings which we can reference. So even if we do have barrel distortion in the image, it really doesn't matter. Now with those two layers still selected, I'm going to hold down Shift and open Objects. Now of course I've got my darker exposure on top and my brighter exposure on the bottom. Now let's say we want to create a mask and select just the sky. Well, as you can see, we've got clouds visible in this sky and some parts of the sky are blue. So if we try and create a mask, we probably can't create a completely white mask, which isn't a massive problem. We might be able to brush in our selection multiple times to make sure that we bring through the darker exposure fully. But sometimes when we're working with images, it's simply not possible to do that. There's too much information in the sky, even though it remains overexposed. So if you have an area like this which you want to make a selection of, but which you probably can't do because there's information there, we can do pre-masking. And that's where, if I double click on the thumbnail of the brighter exposure and bring up Adobe Camera Raw, that's where we can create the mask to some degree with our raw file. So look, if I bring my highlights up, see how white we make the sky? I can do the same with the white slider, but we're also brightening the foreground, which we don't want, because we want the foreground to be deselected in the mask. So what should we do there? Bring down our shadows. You see we're removing the foreground from the mask. Then I can bring the whites up a little bit more. And we've got a little bit of cloud up here, but it's a big difference. Our sky for the most part is white. So if I press OK and select the darker exposure, hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and click on the Add a Layer Mask icon. So we've got a black mask, open Lumi 32, and let's just say we'll go to a brights one. And I think the blue channel is going to give us a better selection here. So we're looking for a selection of the sky without the foreground. And I think that works pretty well. Just to amplify that, I'm going to bring up amplification, so that should give us a more striking selection of the sky, which it does. How about bringing up smoothness so we remove more of that foreground? Now we don't have to remove too much of that because we're going to paint in this selection. So I'm going to press select, select the black mask of my darker exposure, hold down Command and H or Control and H to hide the marching ants. With a white brush at 100% opacity, I'm going to paint in that darker exposure in the sky. Look at that. The whole sky came through without any problems. Now I press Command and D or Control and D to deselect the active selection, and I go back into the raw file of my brighter exposure and press Default. And that brings us back to the level where we were before. Now I still think the foreground is a little bit bright, so I'm going to bring the exposure of this layer down just a little bit. Let's say -25, and I'll press OK. So there, we've blended our exposures. And I think we can all agree that the sky is probably a little bit too dark. So I can bring down the opacity of the sky to around 85%. So there's before and after. So that's what I call pre-masking, where you create a mask in your raw file that you couldn't have created using just luminosity masks. To take this image a little bit further, why don't we open up the raw file again in the brighter exposure and increase clarity. I want to add some local contrast to the foreground and these gorgeous details here. So I'm going to press OK there. So there's the before and after. I think that's a beautiful change. We've got some really enhanced details now in these lines and textures. Then I'm going to select the top exposure and open a levels layer. I just want to give this image a bit of brightness because I think it's perhaps a little bit too dark. Bring down the midtones, soften the shadows a tiny bit. I'm looking for mood and a touch of brightness as well. So with that done, you'll see the sky up here is perhaps a little heavily affected. So let me have a look. That's before and after. Yeah, so I'm going to mask out the bright parts that are overexposed. So we'll do that in Lumi 32. Choose, let's say a bright's 5. You see that's got a really good selection of the overexposed highlights, but I'm going to bring the range up a tiny bit more just to include a few more highlights in the cloud so it's a more smooth change. Press select, Command and H or Control and H, and this time with a black brush because I'm going to paint out that contrast adjustment. And just watch us bring back the overexposed highlights in the sky. There we go. Now I press Command D and Control and D to deselect the active selection. And there's before and after. And let me change this contrast adjustment a little bit more. There we go. Fantastic. Now the next thing I want to do is bring out just a few more details in the foreground here, and I'm going to do that by dodging and burning. So I hold down Control, Alt, Shift and E, or Command, Option, Shift and E on a Mac, and we've got our merge layer on top with our dodge tool, highlight selected and exposure at 20%. I'm going to make a bigger brush. Watch, I'm just going to paint, and I'm not going to take my finger off my mouse button. I'm just painting in the highlights, and the more you go over them, the stronger the effect. I'm going to make a smaller brush and do along here because it's a little bit flat. Perhaps here as well. And of course that's incredibly oversaturated, so I can change the blend mode of that layer to luminosity, and now we just keep the luminosity changes. So there's before and after. And if that's a bit strong, we can bring down the opacity of the dodge and burn layer. Now I'm going to make a change in terms of cropping. I don't think we need the right hand side of this image in, so I'm going to crop the right hand side along a little bit. And where I'm ending it is, you see this line in the foreground that's snaking along. Look at where it finishes, right in the corner. Now that's not essential, but I really like to have that sense of completion in my compositions. I'm also going to drop the clouds a little bit, because while they're deepening the mood of the scene, they're not necessarily essential. The foreground is what we're interested in here. So I'll press OK. And even though we've just enhanced details in the foreground, I'm going to create a very soft autumn effect, just because I think this scene is quite surreal. So it lends itself to extra processing, in my opinion. So in order to do that, we hold down Control, Shift, Alt and E, just as we've done before. That will create this merged layer. We go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I usually use 33. Press OK, and then I bring my opacity of that layer all the way down, usually to around 12 to 15%. Let's say 12% here, and there's before and after. You see we're still keeping those dodge and burn changes, but we're softening some of the harsher textures. It says before and after. Just a very small change. We're not making it too surreal. And again, before and after. And to finish, because this is a very simple workflow, I can create a vignette. So I choose a curves layer, bring the curve down around the upper midtones and the shadows up. Press Command and I or Control and I. Choose a white brush at 100% opacity and make it really big so we have a smooth transition. and I'm going to manually paint in some areas here. Don't worry if the change looks a little bit harsh, we can change that later on. And maybe in the sky up here. And I think that looks all right. And let me bring the opacity down because it's a little bit strong. That's better. And then I'm going to create another curves layer. This time, bring up the mid-tone. Maybe bring the contrast down a tiny bit. Then I'm going to press Command and I or Control and I with a white brush again. I'm going to paint right in the middle of here because this is where we want our viewer to look. So let me make that change a little bit stronger. We don't want to make it extreme. About there. And I'm going to group these two layers. Command and G or Control and G to group them. There's before and after. See, we're pulling the viewer away from the sky and the outsides of the image and pushing them towards this foreground. Now you don't want there to be an obvious vignette line along here like this one. So if you do see that, create a black brush, select the darker vignette with an opacity of about 50% on your brush and just mask it out a bit. And let's see the before and after now. Before and after. See, that's much better. And so this is before all changes and after the changes. Very soft, very subtle. And to be honest with you, with this darker exposure, I don't think we should be making the sky as dark as that. I think the sky's become a little bit distracting. So it's dark enough to not have a vignette around it. So let's do this again. Before and after. So really we're just brightening up the foreground and bringing the viewer's attention there. So for our next example, I've picked a really hard set of images to work with. So essentially these are both long exposures. This bright one is 236 seconds long, while this one, the darker one, is 82 seconds long. Now, you might be wondering why I did a long exposure without any information in the clouds. It seems a bit silly, given that nothing's moving in the foreground. Well, I do that if I have a plan to exposure blend long exposures because it's a lot easier to blend in two long exposures than it is a long exposure into a normal quick exposure. So now let's just look at this for a second. What you can't see right now is that these two exposures aren't aligned. There's slight movement between the two, and that probably has something to do with me wiping the lens or the ND filter. So in Photoshop, we can't auto-align smart objects. We need a way to rasterize these layers and also take advantage of pre-masking and matching. And if you're feeling confident enough, why don't you pause this video and try and blend these exposures yourself and see how challenging it really is. So if you want to do that, press pause now and you can, or just watch along and try not to follow along with the steps yet until you've seen some of the challenges that we face. So I'm going to select these two exposures and just press open images, not open objects. With them stacked on top of each other, I'll select both, go to edit and auto align layers and just press OK. Now this will align our exposures. And let's say I'm going to create a mask on our darker exposure. Well, I can do that. So I can press a brights one, make it really contrasting so that we're not affecting the foreground. And let's say I just press apply here. Now, there are a couple of problems. So firstly, we obviously have to match because this exposure is far too dark to blend into our base exposure. So that's what's happened if I bring down the opacity of the darker exposure. But you can see we've lost loads of the sky, and that's not what we want. The other problem is the fact that a lot of these trees, let's see if I can just bring up the opacity of this exposure. See this line along here? This has happened because the trees in the brighter exposure are clipped. So if I make this mask invisible, we can see the darker exposure and zoom in. You see how many details we have here in the darker exposure. Watch if I make that invisible. You see the trees thin out, they become clipped. But in order to make this a really smooth blend, we need to bring back those trees. Otherwise, the darker and the brighter exposure won't go together particularly well along the horizon. So that means in Adobe Camera Raw, we're going to have to bring down the highlights slider to retrieve these trees in the brighter exposure. But if we do that, we'll retrieve some of the sky as well, and that'll make it harder to create the mask that we want. So with those things in mind, let me show you how I get around this. I'm going to close this and open up the two files again in Photoshop. So here are my two exposures again in Photoshop, and I'm going to do the usual cleaning of them. And then I go to the main section in Adobe Camera Raw. The first thing I want to do is bring down the highlight slider. So you see we're recovering as much of the sky as possible. And obviously this isn't workable. We can't use this in our final image. But we're just doing this so that we can restore some of the clipped trees. So this is the trees we were looking at before and after. You see, they were really clipped, but now they look a lot better. Now we don't want them to be too dark. So let's bring up the highlight slider a little bit, -78. Let's look along here. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Now, with the darker exposure, it's fine for us to do a little bit of matching. So we're going to brighten up that darker exposure and bring our highlights down significantly. So we don't want to brighten it up too much, just enough so that we've got information in these trees. Now with those changes made, we hold down Control or Command on a PC and select the base exposure, hold down Shift and open Smart Objects. So with our images now in Photoshop, in order to create a really good selection of this sky, we need it to be white. So we're going to pre-mask like we did in the last workflow, but we need to keep this layer here, the matched base exposure layer. So I'm going to right click on this brighter exposure and choose New Smart Object via Copy. This is different to duplicating that exposure. If you duplicate the brighter exposure, that means whatever changes you make in Adobe Camera Raw on the duplicated layer will also affect the original layer because those two are linked. But now since we've copied as a new smart object, we can bring our highlights back. See? Just bring it up a little bit. And we can bring our shadows down so we don't select the foreground, the mask, and we're creating a mask. Press OK. And now we need to rasterize these three layers so that we can align them with Auto Align. So we right click on them and go to Rasterize Layers. Then with all the layers selected, we go to Edit, Auto Align Layers, and OK. All three of our layers should be now lined up. There we are. And to create our mask, I'm going to take the pre-mask layer. In fact, I'm going to call it pre-mask and leave it at the bottom. Then I'm going to select my darker exposure, but keep it invisible. I'm going to open Lumi 32, choose a bright one, and just bring up the smoothness a little bit, just to increase the contrast so it's not affecting the foreground too much. Then I press Apply. Now that looks pretty good. Seems to be a relatively natural blend. The foreground's dark because of course we made it dark in the previous exposure. And if you look at the horizon here, you'll see we've got this strange transparent edging, which is what we saw earlier. But watch what happens. So this middle exposure here, this is our base exposure where we brought the highlights down. So this is our matched base exposure. Watch what happens when I make it visible. You see that? That weird invisible edging has kind of disappeared a bit. Now don't get me wrong, there is still a little bit of edging, but it looks much more natural now. So here's before, so this is with the pre-mask exposure visible, and this is with the normal exposure visible. You see, it does look better, although far from perfect. And this is the sky in the pre-mask exposure before. And these are the trees on this horizon. So this is the pre-mask horizon, and this is the matched horizon. You see, again, the trees look much more natural. Now, we can bring down the opacity of this darker exposure if we find that it looks a little bit too unnatural. And by doing that, you see, the trees look much, much better. Now, bear in mind, we're zooming in here 260%. So there's naturally going to be a little bit of fringing around the trees, especially when we're working with files like the ones we're working with, which aren't perfectly shot. So I'm going to zoom in here as well. I mean, that horizon, you wouldn't know that these exposures have been blended at all. It's completely flawless. And zooming along here as well, it looks fantastic. Some of the treetops have a slightly darker edge, but again, we're zoomed in at 246%. So it's not a huge deal. Now, with this pre-mask layer selected, I'm going to put it in the bin. So there is before and after. So now I think the scene is a little bit too dark, so I'm going to open up a levels layer with my base exposure selected. And I'm going to bring that levels layer along just to brighten up some of that base exposure. So you see we're brightening it up. And I don't want it to be too bright or unnatural. And I think that should just about do it. Again, I'm going to have a look at this horizon to make sure it looks natural enough. And I think perhaps it's a little bit too bright on the horizon. So I'm going to choose a black brush and I'm just going to paint out that brightness layer, which is fine because we only want this contrast adjustment for the foreground. This is where we want the viewer to look, at the lines, the T-field lines. Now with that done, I'm going to take the crop tool and I'm going to crop out the changes that came after we auto-aligned these layers. Now guys, if you find it hard to control the crop tool, like it jumps forward a little bit, you can hold down Control or Command on a Mac while you're moving this and it'll give you more precise control. And I think I need to do a little bit more down here. Just bring it up a little bit. Maybe on the left a little bit too. Oh, and we've got a tiny bit on the right still. So there we go, that's a little bit better. So what do we do now? Well, how about an overall contrast adjustment? So I'm going to open another levels layer because this scene is particularly flat. I'm going to give this whole scene much more contrast. So there's before and after. Now we are in danger of losing some of this sky up here. So with Lumi 32 and let's say a Brights 5, we're going to target that part of the sky. And let's bring a little bit more of that in. There we go. Press select with a black brush and foreground and an opacity of 100%. Press Control and H or Command and H. We can paint out that contrast adjustment. Maybe a little bit there too. So there's before and after. Then I'm going to press Command and D or Control and D, and I'm actually going to take this darker exposure and bring up the opacity a little bit, just so we don't lose too many of the textures in the clouds. Maybe a little bit more. And now what you'll find is, because I've decided to increase the opacity, now the trees up here probably look a little bit surreal again. The good news is there is a way to adjust for that. So let me zoom in and you'll see they've gone a little bit bright again, as opposed to before when they were looking much more natural. And a way to fix that is actually to press Control and J or Command and J while having the darker exposure selected. So press Control and J, we duplicate that layer, and again and again. So I've pressed it 3 times now. And look at the trees. This is before we duplicated the layer. You see we have this kind of transparent edging. And this is after we duplicated that layer. And now it looks much more natural. So let's zoom in and have a good look. So we're zoomed in 150% here, 236, and I think that looks pretty good. And again, zoomed into these trees, and I think they look absolutely fine. My only concern is that we've darkened the foreground slightly. So if I select all these layers, make a group for those darker exposures, create a mask on that group, and a black brush, look, we can brush out the darker exposure. Oops, I accidentally went into the sky there, so be more careful when you're doing this. So there we have it, before and after. So there are different ways to deal with some of the challenges when you're blending really difficult exposures. Again, it's quite unlikely that you're going to come up with some of the difficulties that we're facing in this particular video. I've chosen this because it is such a hard image to process. You know, we've got a really dark, long exposure, which is too dark to really blend into anything else. We've got movement between these exposures. And we've got a pink cast from the B&W ND filter, which I quite like, but sometimes it makes things a bit messy. So if you can blend this image cleanly, then you can blend pretty much any landscape. Now, before I go any further, I want to bring even more detail into those clouds. So I'm going to create a curves layer and clip it to that group. And all I want to do is just bring down contrast a tiny bit and bring up the mid-tones. And so that's before and after. And we don't want to affect the colors in that layer because it's oversaturating them. So we can change the blend mode of that layer to luminosity. So there we go. We're just bringing in a little bit more movement into those clouds, a little bit more detail. So now that we've done that challenging process, let's dodge and burn like we did in the last image. And I know that this is a destructive process, but I still think that this is the best way to burn in Photoshop. So hold down Control Alt Shift and E, or Command Option Shift and E on a Mac. Then you go to your dodge tool. Again, I'm going to stick with highlights at 20, make a relatively big brush, and we're going to try and bring more detail into these T fields. We want to give the impression as if the remnants of light in the sky here are touching the fields, just brightening it up a little bit. And again, we can be quite creative with this image because it's a little bit of a surreal image. So there's before and after. And should I change that to luminosity? No, I think I quite like the added saturation. Now again, a levels layer. Let's see if we can do a general contrast adjustment. So bring in that highlight slider along, but I'm going to bring the mid-tone slider along and deepen those shadows. I want to create that soft, dark, moody feel. That's probably a little bit strong, so if I bring the midtones along a bit more and the output level left a little bit more. That's before and after. Perhaps we can be a little bit more daring with that. That's before and after. Yeah, I think that looks really good, even if it is a little bit too dark. So to fix that darkness, we'll open a curves layer and bring up the midtones, the upper midtones there, and keep the shadows where they are more or less. Now I press Command and I or Control and I on that mask. And with a white brush, I'm going to paint in the foreground. It says before and after. And now that we've done a few more contrast adjustments, I think the color has gotten a little bit strong in that burn layer. So I'm going to change the blend mode to luminosity after all. So there we go, there's before and after. Probably going to bring the opacity of that down a little bit too as well. And one technique I do when I'm post-processing is I often choose the zoom tool and zoom out to get a larger sense of how the image looks, to see if it's working or not. And I think the foreground might be a little bit too dark still. So with the levels layer, I'm going to brighten that up quite a lot. And then I'm going to invert the mask with a white brush. Let me paint this in even more. And reduce that opacity. So let me zoom out again. That's before and after. I think the foreground color might be lacking in something, but I'm not exactly sure what it is yet. So why don't I open a vibrance layer and increase the vibrance. I think that looks quite good actually, the greens in the foreground. There's the before and after. Yeah, I think that makes a big difference. Before, after. We can also, if we want, open up a photo filter and a warming filter, let's say the second one, bring along the density of that. If I press Command and I or Control and I can just paint that into the foreground as if it's warming up the foreground, the sky. It says before and after. But actually, I think I prefer the greens. So I'm going to delete that. And we saw earlier how an Orton effect can soften the details of a scene. So let's give that a try again. So we hold down Control, Alt, Shift and E, merge all our layers, or Command, Option, Shift and E, go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, press OK, bring that opacity down. And you can see with a lot of my images, okay, there are different techniques like pre-masking and matching, but the core of them are very similar. With about 20% of my landscapes, I'll do a really soft Orton effect if I think the landscape is surreal enough or a little bit different enough. I always do the vignettes that you've seen. I often enhance details, and I don't make things any more complex than they need to be. So I'm just zooming in here to look at the sharpness, the crispness. I think that looks really good. And then if I zoom out again, I think that looks great. My only reservation is perhaps some of the purple in the sky here. It's not the end of the world, and it's caused by the ND filter, the B&W ND filter. But if you don't like it, you can easily merge all of your layers, go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and you can add in some cooler temperature or some tint which will reduce the purple. See, now we've got a more natural looking sky, which is fine too. And now one thing I've just noticed if I zoom into the sky here is that it's overexposed. So I must have masked out one part of the darker exposure, and let me just see where that was. And this is what happens when you're talking while post-processing. So it looks like when I was dodging and burning, I burned too much of the sky there. So it's before and after. So I'm going to select all these layers. Zoom out a little bit. And let's see if I can delete the layer that we created just there, which was the color correction. Then I'm going to select this dodge and burn layer, put a mask on it, and with a black brush, just paint back in some of that darker exposure. And then we can do that again with the color correction, just as we did before. Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and bring in the green to remove some of the pink in the sky. That adds a little bit of green to the foreground too. So there's before and after. That's much better. And of course, you've probably noticed there is some dirt in the sky here. And that's pretty easy to remove. We can select the patch tool, make sure we've got content aware selected, and sample all layers, and we create a brand new layer on top of our layers. And then we can just draw around the dirt and take it to an area of similar brightness. And press Command and D or Control and D to deselect the active selection, and you can see it hasn't done a great job. It's left a big patch there. So let's try a different spot. That didn't work. Different spot, maybe somewhere in the middle. And if none of that works, which clearly it's not happening here, we can undo it and instead go to the clone stamp. So make a bigger clone stamp. Let's say we're going to do around here. Press Alt, select there, and paint in over the dirt. And that's done a much better job. And so let's see if we can do that with the patch tool as well. And so I'll just paint around this area here. And drag it to an area of similar brightness right next to it, let's say. In fact, I can press Control and H or Command and H, and that'll hide that selection. I can bring that along there, and we can do it each time until we do a better job, or we find an area that does a better job like that. Then I can zoom out, and that's more or less the final image. And I think the greens are perhaps a little bit over exaggerated, so I'm going to open a hue saturation layer, select the hand, click on the greens, and make sure the greens are selected, and then just bring the saturation down ever so slightly. There's before and after, just a slight reduction. And so that's how you use pre-masking and matching to work with two very difficult files.